All right. I didn't think of what it would sound like the phone sounds like on a different tectonic plate. I'm not sure if that's the same ring y'all have there, but nevertheless, vector artist Rebecca Noel Ati, thank you for being here and talking about what you do. In preparation, I looked up what vector art was, and I think everybody is pretty familiar with raster art or raster images, which is just pixelated. I think that may be an oversimplification, but the pixelation and the advantage of the vector art being that you can size it up and size it down without degrading the image value, unlike with a pixel where the pixel is just the pixel, and if you make it a lot bigger, it's going to be degraded more. So with doing the vector art, it has a lot of points, lines, and mathematics involved. That's interesting. How do you explain what you do, and how do you market it to businesses?
Well, thank you so much for having me, first of all. And yeah, that's a really interesting question to dive into. I will note that one of the challenges of the work I do actually does involve explaining what I do to clients. And one thing I noticed is that some clients can get a little bit of pushback. You know, people can get really into their own spaces. So a lot of designers, they're into all these principles of design. And then when they're working with a client, maybe the client doesn't understand, they blame the client. And I like to think that if the client knew all of these things, they wouldn't need to hire you. So it kind of is a role as a part of our job to be educators too, because that's a part of the process that creates a seamless process with that client so that they don't run into frustrations. But, you know, not without, we don't want to over-educate people and overwhelm them and then have them feel like they're designing everything themselves. So it's really interesting because I remember when I was quite young, actually, my mom was a designer and she would have these design files. I was really artistically oriented at the time. And she would just give them to me and say, you know, play around with it. So I was getting a bit familiar with that structure, which is quite different to, you know, drawing, kind of more like building out something with Legos with pieces and parts. And I didn't really know that I was becoming familiar with that. I didn't comprehend how it worked. I remember particularly one time because the way that vectors work is that, you know, we're dealing with geometric and mathematical equations, which is why the computer can redraw it at any resolution because it's kind of like programming. There's a file that you could actually read and write and edit in a programming language, an SVG language, that would also create an SVG. But when we're a vector artist, we're using an interface. So I remember one time I didn't comprehend that yet because I was just working in this vector program as something that was really neat and interesting. And I remember one time I had scaled something down really small, scaled it back up, and I was just used to that being how it is. I can infinitely scale anything anyway. And once I had tried using a raster program because I was introduced the other way around, I got really confused when it was getting pixelized. And so that's kind of a core memory I have about that because with raster images, they're a lot smaller. That's actually something a lot of people don't know. It's essentially, I would compare it to a printer. You know, you have your Word document, you can edit it. It has a lot of data about what you're writing. The fonts are changeable. Once you print that on a piece of paper, you can't edit it anymore, but it's still really essential. That's why we're always exporting things as raster images for the web because that website doesn't need all that information.
How does the computer then make is a vector file a bigger file than a regular pixelated one, or is it smaller because it can change the sizes within it?
Well, it's really interesting because there's actually different types of vector files. So there's essentially what you would call a working vector file, so kind of like Adobe Illustrator or Inkscape or program. These can be a little heavier and incompatible. But actually, this is a very recent development. People, and I would say recent as in compared to when I got into this, it's been a few years, but people started incorporating SVGs into websites in a very clean format. So let's say you look at that text document or that programming language. If that's a really, really small document and it's containing very small amount of data, just saying, draw these shapes, make something really simple, a lot of people are using that so they don't have to upload several versions of an image or work around how to scale it. However, if you're creating something super complex, a huge amount of effects, that's where you really don't want to be uploading an SVG. That's going to take forever to load.
Okay. So the SVG is that's the vector file versus like a JPEG, which is I guess they're both digital, but is pixelated.
Yeah, so a lot of times, just depending on the use case, so sometimes people use SVGs in development, say maybe an icon, because even when I started in design, I don't know if you remember this as well, because it was a very design-centric area, but we used to have to create only raster icons, and we would create them in 5 sizes, so that when the program was scaled up or in different parts of the program, we'd have to draw those from scratch, because essentially the way our screens work, which are made up of these RGB pixels, it could become distorted and blurry when we scaled them to different sizes. So we had to do that manually. It was once the technology was able to incorporate SVGs that you see that used in maybe like UI, in website icons. But when it comes to what I do usually, which is a bit more illustrative, that's where a lot of illustrators will use SVGs as a medium, kind of like painting and artistic style, to build out illustrations. But we pretty much always export it into raster. It's not really, I would say rasters aren't unsuperior. Rather, they have their own place as a compressed file that has all that information, really similar to how you would think of a printer to the working file.
Okay, so is a vector file good for doing photos, or is it not as good at doing photorealistic?
Yeah, so you could definitely work within, let's say you're trying to create art that's photorealistic, but I would say that's definitely more of something that would benefit from a digital painter. And digital painters, when you take a picture with your camera and that's a raster image and you zoom in, it's pixelated. So there are digital painters who, out of preference, work in raster. So they're working in Photoshop or GIMP to create pixel-based images, just because, well, essentially, since vectors are using math, it's kind of similar to Legos, where you have a limited number of shapes and options you can work with. And the really, really complex shines and shadows would require sometimes equations that we don't even have access to or haven't developed in vectors yet. And even though it's gone a long way since it started, it's really more preferable for highly geometric work, really simple work, and work that is considering or needs these really, really precise shapes. Whereas digital painting is great for artists that want to create photorealism or really, really complex shines and shadows. So there are some people who, just for the fun of the challenge, create photorealistic images in vector, but it's really not the standard. And as far as, go ahead.
Do you think that vector is going to progress to the point where it has more of those equations built into it so it can do more of the photorealistic? Is it going to be the new standard, or is it just always going to be a supplement or a different thing than the raster images?
I would say it probably will always be different. As I've worked with vectors, there are a lot of, how do you put this? Kind of like how there's a lot of different ways to create an engine. But when you're starting with ignition, the entire process going all the way down to a working engine is going to be such a different approach with different limitations and abilities than when people are starting with steam power, or even when they're trying to do, water power and things like that. So I think that people will definitely explore, and we see a lot of features being developed in terms of, really, vectors work with two or I would say 3 main principles, which is geometry. So we're really limited to how we can imagine and put shapes together. And then we have our pin tool, our kind of very standard vector tool, which is complex geometry. This is different curves and lines that use mathematics. And a lot of times we just work with this so long, we kind of get a feel for predicting where these curves will form as we're drawing with that. So it's a very different experience drawing with a pencil or paper. If you've ever seen like a CAD drawing where they have those lines depicting the angle of a curve or these different markings for how the geometry will be built, that's very similar to a vector process. And then we have gradients, which is, I would say, the most limiting part of vectors, even though that limitation can create really interesting styles, because for a long time, the only option for shading and shadows that we had was from one color to another color, just as a straight line. And in real life, shadows are so reflective, shines are so reflective of colors and light and subtle details. And so that's the one area I've seen develop the most over time, is more complex ways to create gradients. But because we're limited to these mathematical equations, I really believe that if someone wanted to create something more complex, it would start going into 3D work and digital painting, just because, especially with digital painting, one of the benefits is there's no mathematics going on within, I mean, the software is being developed by developers, and that is one part of sciences, but really the options are less limited, but it's just much less precise. So I think that there's a place for people pushing the boundaries, but I also see this sort of distinctive divide between how the styles develop in each of these formats, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So with your interface that you use for the vector, how is that? I take it you're not programming in mathematical equations. You have some sort of mask over it that you can put the shape in and create the art that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have an interface, although there are people who are really purist and, like I said, people always love pushing the boundaries. There are people who can completely write SVGs. There's also web developers that do that. But even today we have, even website development has a lot of these interfaces where you mix and match different plugins and you have this very visual interface. So that's really similar to what vector work is. We do deal with some of this mathematical parts of vectors because of the way it's built out. So a lot of times we are dealing with numbers, we're inputting different numbers and merging shapes together and dealing with, for example, we have to still decide if we're going to round a corner, what that radius is with a number. And so we do have to think in that way, but that interface really connects those worlds together.
Wow. So it's not like you're looking at the matrix and you're just seeing
Absolutely.
letters and numbers. You have a interface that makes it a little easier to deal with than just doing equations.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the
What
things
kind?
that,
Go
oh, I'm
ahead.
sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. One of the things. Go ahead.
One of the things that is really emphasized with that is that even if we're exporting that vector as a raster image, because it's calculated and the computer can redraw it at any size, because it has that kind of base calculation and it understands what you're creating. If someone wants to create something really large, like a car wrap or a giant poster, that's where it really comes in handy for, if someone's designing a huge poster, even though vector has its own set of styles that it's kind of adapt for, and then raster also has those set of styles, that's where if someone's creating something really large, that's the perfect time to consider what vector styles they want, because the tools used to create raster images and raster illustrations are going to be a lot more limited in terms of the file size and the flexibility to scale it to different sizes. So essentially, I would say the most important part about vector designs is that source file, because when you're drawing digitally, the only thing that your computer understands is the color of the pixels you're drawing. So it doesn't have any other information. When you have a source file, you can scale it down and up and also modify it to a greater extent, because that information and the creation of it was kind of, it's almost as if someone was tracking and writing notes on everything you were doing and is able to remember and duplicate that anytime you want to modify it.
So if you're doing a wrap for like a bus or something, it's most likely going to be a vector file, and that's why you have the shapes, more
Absolutely.
of the shape in those. Okay, interesting. Do y'all have an influence with AI working on vector files or in that industry?
So the development of AI is quite interesting because I think it's still in development. So most of AI artwork is actually Raster as of now. There are a few engines and Adobe's experimenting with some AI. I think the biggest issue we're facing right now may have to do with the specifics, like I said, because vector artwork is usually built with a lot of precision. I'm not sure I'm seeing that precision yet, but honestly, I have no way of knowing how it would develop. So I don't really want to try to predict it either way, since it could really, it's developing quite quickly. And I think my biggest hope for it is just that people develop it ethically and that it would be helpful to people in some way as it develops. But definitely, it's been extremely recent because most of the AI artwork was raster, but they have just kind of recently expanded into being able to generate really similar to kind of like clip art vectors off of some prompts.
Yeah, it seems like if you take the Lego equation, it's just like either people would have to program new pieces, or you would take an AI and they would be able to say, well, I need these types of pieces. So you'd come up with these super specialty formulas that a person might say, I'm not going to bother making a formula for this little piece, but a computer would work faster at it and say, these are all the specialty pieces that you can use.
It would be definitely really interesting to see how that develops. And like I said, my biggest hope for it is just that people push in the direction. I know there's a lot of concerns over the source material for where AI is basing and training their material on. And so my biggest hope is that there are some people who really base these generators, especially when it comes to, the vector ones like you're talking about, within public domain libraries. I think that would be really interesting. And that's one area that is already completely remixable and open to people to use works from the past and kind of keep them alive. So even in my work, I don't use AI currently, but even in my work as a person, I reference a lot of public domain resources in my research. A lot of my projects involve a lot of historical and maybe vintage elements that I have to research. So I think those libraries are also something that, really interestingly, a lot of people have spent a huge amount of time retracing public domain works within vectors. So there's a lot of really interesting and valuable resources built up over time. And I think that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I wonder if people see it differently as the type of AI that would write a story versus the type of AI that would draw a picture. I guess the picture has a point to it. Like if the computer wants to, however they were programmed to make an image that depicts a certain thing or tries to get a certain emotion out. But as far as just the base components of making a formula to make a piece of art, that it seems like a program would be unconcerned with all those other things. It's more of, I want to be able to capture all these shapes and probably start with so many like Pythagorean theorem and the golden ratio and Fibonacci sequence and all that. And I would think the natural curiosity of the AI or the computer intelligence would be kind of like people, except just a lot more, a lot quicker.
One thing I find really interesting based on what you're saying is that, we have, like Elon Musk talking about Neuralink. And when you look back on it, this has been a technology that's been well and alive for a long time. A lot of people have been researching ways to connect people who, have missing limbs with, connecting neural technology. And a lot of that wasn't very publicized or was in its research phase. So I would say it's really similar in the sense that tools like Adobe have been, because the definition of AI is also something that can be a little shaky sometimes. So when it comes to automated tools, I think that's where actually I might argue that some of these automation tools that people would kind of define as AI now have probably been in process or being incorporated into vector softwares for a long time now. And I think when I mentioned the gradients, that's one part of it. So, for example, a recent tool that Adobe Illustrator has used is kind of, there are a lot of times where perhaps you would want to create a really complex gradient. And in order to do that, you'd have to duplicate a shape, 1,000 times. So they have tools where you can trace the line that you're looking for and then define this start and end point, and it'll create all those copies for you. So more and more, you kind of become like the director or the orchestrator of the piece, and the vision and idea becomes the most important part. So I wouldn't be surprised. And when I talked about ethics in AI, I think that would be an area where I would definitely say that would be a really responsible way to incorporate these automated processes without losing the artistic integrity. Because especially one thing I'll mention here, I don't know if you've heard of Canva before. So this is a kind of pretty popularized art tool. And honestly, a lot of designers really hated it because they said, oh, well, this is automating all of our work. And I had a pretty different perspective on that one, because when you think about it from the perspective of accessibility, there's a lot of people who don't have access to design software. So a lot of people who want to learn design, but they can't, cash out so a lot of subscription money for Adobe. There's a lot of people who can't afford to hire a designer. And I don't really think that's going to change anything for the designers who are pursuing these high-level skills and excellence for people who do need those skills. I think that accessibility is kind of always a good thing, especially there's a lot of people out there who need those tools, and I think it's probably helped a lot of people. And then there's also the portion of people that probably have gotten into design because of this. Maybe they started with Canva, and then they found it limiting, and then they started learning other software. So I don't really see that as a negative thing at all.
Yeah. Well, anytime you get something that does what you do, it gets a little scary, I guess, for people. Because
Yeah.
I took all this time to learn this thing, and now it can just be done so quickly. Like if you go to medical school and you take years to do that, and then eventually there's some sort of Neuralink that you can just download medical school into your,
Absolutely.
your thought in 30 seconds, then that's going to stink for everybody that went. But it's a net gain. It's just the time invested, I think, will be seen as lost. But then there'll probably still be the view of it's better, or there's some advantage, or there's a reason to go back and do things these old ways where, like, if you're going to get a paintbrush and some paint and go make some art instead of using a program to do it, even though the program will do it so much quicker.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
I don't think there's any artist out there right now who hasn't faced a lot of existentialism and a lot of thoughts about what they do with all these developments. I've talked about it a lot to my husband. I've talked to other artists. I think for me, that's a direction that history is taking. I think that there's definitely concerns as far as how people implement these things. I hope that it doesn't go in the direction of, art theft. But if people can regulate that part of it, I think the conclusion I came to, if you look throughout history, I mean, I look at people like in software development, and that's been changing consistently since they started. I think a lot of artists got into art and found it very comforting. It was very stable. And I think when we look at a lot of these other industries, these other people have had to evolve and have had to learn new skills. And so I think that part of me at first was really challenged, but then I consider that maybe I've gotten really comfortable in that comfort zone, in that unchanging art scene that, where my skills were very competitive for the landscape that we had. So I think for me, it's just a call for artists to improve our skills, to look at where we're needed, to reassess. And I think a lot of other industries have had to do that continuously. I'm just not sure that, us artists never really expected ourselves to be included in that.
Yeah, it's that unavoidable push to progress that
Mhm.
maybe that's good that people don't live more than 100 years usually is because you would hold things back so much that if you're in the industry for 10 to 20 years, maybe 40 or 50, and then new things come along, and then the next group takes it and accelerates it more and accelerates it more, that I think that's how you get progress. Otherwise, we'd still be smashing berries to make different colors
Mhm.
versus however we do it now. So yeah, that's interesting. Do you think that there'll ever be a program or a time where you'll be able to mix vector and raster so you can get the reflections that a pixel can give you, but you have the scalability and ease of the geometry side of it?
I think that we may be able to. I think that's a very real possibility. I was actually just this week testing out a program that kind of claimed to do that.
Mm.
And I didn't find it up to par on the promises, but I really hope that maybe over time it can develop in that direction. I think it would be really interesting because, like I said, when we look at traditional arts, we have like oil painting and pastels and watercolors. And for a long time in the digital space, we created a lot of new styles, like I said, with the vectors and digital painting. So if we can combine those things together, I wonder what kind of new possibilities there could be and what kind of things we could draw. I think that on one hand, it's usually limitations that create a style. And then on the other hand, we can open up so many new possibilities in the future by developing and mixing these different concepts together. I would be really curious to see how people are able to manage that, or if it develops into a completely new format, perhaps like instead of a vector with a raster on top of it. I'd be really curious to see if eventually vector, falls to the wayside and something else replaces it as the standard. I had this really interesting experience. Um, I was getting my eyes checked up for my glasses, and at the front desk, the lady there asked what I do for a living. I told her I'm a vector designer, and she kind of sighed and she said, "Well, you guys replaced my job. I used to be a designer, and I don't know how to use vector programs." And I think about that, and I think of how I feel so challenged by sometimes by the progress of developments, and how I'll probably be the one at the front desk someday, sighing and saying, "Okay, well, I used to be a vector designer." And so I think that's where I start to ask myself, what attitude am I taking, and how open am I to evolving so that I don't become the person sighing at everyone else.
Yeah, that's that unstoppable force of progress again, where you got to keep up for a certain amount of time, and if you have other people coming in and just replacing you and pushing it forward, it's easy to just get out of the current of that, and then you're just off doing your own little thing. Maybe you open up a artisanal school of vector art,
Mhm.
so back in the day when people are still making bells by hand, and now they have a assembly line that makes them. That's how you'll do your art then. It's
Mhm.
you'll have the class of people with the brush, and then you'll have you doing the program, and then whatever's next. Yeah, it's
Well,
tough.
and
That is. Go ahead.
I apologize. We keep talking at the same time, and I'm really curious. Go ahead.
That's that overlap between art and science again, where it's you you're not going to be able to stop it. You got to find the part where you can be in it,
Mhm.
and then try to keep up as long as you can.
Yeah, and for me, I think that's an openness as well to. I think it's just about self reflection and assessment. Where am I at in the scheme of things? I think that one thing I have noticed is that a lot of these fundamentals in design kind of disappeared. I've been in design for 8 years now, so I've kind of seen different phases, and it moves quite quickly, especially when it comes to the digital spaces. So I noticed that a lot of brands kind of rebrand like an outfit change. It used to be a rebrand was a really significant process. And so a lot of these things I learned in the past about these fundamentals became less important. So I think that we look at maybe like manufacturing a chair that's on the assembly line, and that's how most people buy their chairs. But there are still people who craft these things traditionally. So I think the question becomes, you can really dive into, like what you mentioned, those fundamentals and not losing the art, the original art, and keeping that alive as the direction you go in. You can also look at how to make progress. I'm really curious. Like I said, I mean, I got into design out of curiosity to begin with. So I'm just really curious and fascinated with how it progresses. I've actually been even experimenting with how can I take both sides of my mind and put them together in that way. Recently, I created a piece where I drew with markers, and I hadn't touched a page in a little while just because I've been working a lot digitally. And when originally the beginnings of my artistic kind of interest was with pastels and painting, and then the vectors that my mom sent me. So I then went into a vector program and created the line art for it because I thought that would just be fun and odd. You don't usually see really clean vector lines on top of a painting. That's kind of strange and interesting. So I think it's just something to consider, to explore. And, I think it's a good thing for the people who push to not lose those arts. There's still people out here fermenting soybeans by hand to create soy sauce that's delicious and has rich flavors. And that does have some scarcity to it in the sense that it's not as common anymore. And there's people also developing completely new techniques on how to create ingredients that have a really long shelf life that are available to everyone. And that's also really interesting in food sciences. So I think that there's a lot of areas to explore. And really, the important thing is that we may be out of our comfort zones, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing all the way. Especially, I think when we're on the edge of this huge progression, the important thing is if we all give up, then it's the people who don't care that will lead where this goes. So I think it's important that we consider how the impact of our decisions and how we try to develop artwork in this landscape will impact the direction that it leads into.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, there's still people that are interested in cave art. So definitely you don't see the demand for cave art that you would for something more recent, but yeah,
it's
I
still
wonder
there.
if the butterfly misses being a caterpillar, I don't know. When you get a job to illustrate a book, how do you approach that?
Well, I really take an interesting approach here because how do I put this? So when I first began working in the art industry, I kind of went straight into an internship, part-time job, full-time job. Then I went to art direction. So I was a bit too eager, you could say, to get into it. And because of that, I did get a lot of in-house experience. But I noticed really consistently that a lot of my initial experience was, for example, there was one time I was assigned to do this project, and I looked at it and I said, I can do way better than all of the coupons they've designed in the past. I had this kind of artist ego. And when I designed that, the client rejected it and said, well, our target audience is 60 plus. This looks way too new. This looks way too current. And that I had a lot of experiences like that really shifted my perspective. So working in the industry, and I wasn't really doing a lot of solo work for myself at the time, I realized that the style and the project has to be closely defined by what the client needs, that I'm not just creating art for fun. I'm just creating this for myself, that someone needs something. And I think sometimes people think of art as kind of an exception to these rules, but really if you hired a contractor to fix up your sink and they go and fix your toilet instead, that's not acceptable. So it kind of dawned on me that, yeah, I really need to listen first. And I talk a lot about what I call listen first approach. So I think that's the core of what I do when I'm approaching a project. And that's sometimes why my style can vary a lot. And, there's something to be said about people who have a really consistent style. There's strengths to different approaches. But for me, a lot of times I try to listen to what people need, what people want, why they want it. And I talked about how a lot of styles are created from limitations. So you look at different art movements like, Cubism or Impressionism. A lot of times there's limitations, like you can only use boxes or you can only use this many colors. I kind of took this idea that maybe I could take the limitations from the client and try to make a style out of that. So many times, designers, when we start a project, we have an idea in mind for what's best for the client. And I remember I had this person I was working with to develop merchandise. And she said, I hate the color green. I just hate it. I can't stand it. I want you to draw landscapes, like grassy fields. And for a moment, I'm thinking, how do I pull this off? But I ended up delving into pretty advanced color theory, going in these like off blues and hints of green and maybe sunsets and landscapes. And I found that, wow, this is some of my best work. So I think sometimes taking those challenges and trying to work with them actually is where I developed a lot of the styles and ideas from. So I think that would pretty much sum up the core of what I do and how I approach those projects and the work that I have collaborated on.
Yeah, you're executing the vision of the client, I guess. Do you have a time where you can present like 3 different things? Like you think this is what they're asking for, so you do that, and then you do this other thing that you're like, but this is pretty cool, so you do that one, and then maybe you do it a different way just to say, I want to do something that's not those things, and then present it to them? Or is it just so much you don't have enough time to do all that?
I would say there's actually, my sister is a writer, and I remember that she referenced some advice she got for writing, and it really struck me. And they said that many times people critique your writing, and you should always listen to the critique, but don't listen to the advice they gave you. So a lot of times I look at it, maybe a client says, I don't like green, use yellow. And I come back to them and say, I don't think yellow would work for this, but I hear you that you don't like green. How about blue? So I think that's when I talked about us being educators. It's still my job to think about the principles of design, but I have to listen to where their issues are, or if they say, this is my audience, we don't like this. So I think that's where I'm trying to take it in stride, but still, that's where I think of it as a collaboration, because they're hiring me. So it's my job to help them along that path of getting the result they want. But, it should look good and it should be, well, effective for what they want it for, whether it be educating people or driving engagement. So if they give me too much text and they need something really engaging, I know people don't read that much. So I come back to them and collaborate with them. Hey, how do we shorten this text? And if they say we can't, maybe I ask, well, what's important? What do you want to say? And once they drive home those important pieces that are important to them, that's where we can start shortening that text to fit into the goal that they have. So a lot of it is problem solving and troubleshooting.
Do you work with a marketing person and then you do the drawing, or are you kind of playing both of those parts?
Yeah, so I have kind of a variety of, I have some partners I work with where they, because art is kind of used in a variety of ways. One way that I focus on is, for example, manufacturing. So there's a manufacturing company and they work with an agency that kind of writes all of their content and their marketing and things like that. And then they work with me as a partner to provide the illustrative parts of that. So that's a lot of times we form these partnerships. I've worked in marketing before, but I found that my passion really lies in this kind of like you mentioned the thing about time. And I think that's a good point, where I feel like if I was handling all of the marketing and everything at once, I wouldn't be able to consider all of these points together. A lot of people I work with, they have very technical work. So their design woes is that many times I hire a designer, and I had a project like this. They were talking about bioscience, and they said, I tried to work with a designer in this in the past. They gave me these beautiful icons, but it was not a DNA strand. It was just vaguely something that looked like that. So that's where I wouldn't really be able to work with people like that. I think if I was taking all the roles at once, And there have been times that I felt like as an artist, I should be able to do everything at once. I actually, I co-founded a studio with my husband, and I have two other designers that I created that with. So I'm kind of recently in development for me has been learning that I don't have to do everything at once and I don't have to be in competition with everyone. That to get the best results, sometimes I have to back away and focus on what I do best. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. Definitely, we focus mostly on the illustration itself and the designs themselves. And then either companies contact us directly, or we have partnerships with other companies for those areas that need more advanced campaign planning and marketing.
Yeah, you can definitely get to the point where you have too many minds and you're trying to do too much. No doubt you could do it all. It's just, you only have a certain amount of time to do a job. So if it was something where you had an infinite amount of time, then certainly you could do every piece of it.
Mhm.
But that's why you hire the different people, is you have the marketer. Like I think of the show Mad Men, where you have the people that come up with the slogans, and then you
Mhm.
have the people that draw the art, and then you have the people that sell it or go out to find new customers or to sell those advertising space to other
Mhm.
people. That everybody could do it at once, but yeah, you have to have more people do it to do it quicker.
Well, absolutely. And well, the other thing for me is I kind of found that unique perspective that I had at the time. I actually, when I worked as a creative director the first time, this is before I started my own studio, um, I kind of encountered a mirror situation where I would go to these. I was managing some freelancers at the time. The company was outsourcing, to scale up for some larger projects. And I told them, I need you to design this. And they said, well, I can do better than this. Or, they had that same pushback. Oh, I don't want to work within these specs. This doesn't look good. I can't do
Mm.
this. One I remember really clearly was that I told them the client wants to italicize this line. And they said, well, this font doesn't have italics. I said, okay, well, can you shear it? Can you make it slanted? They said, well, that's not italic. I said, okay, well, then I want you to shear it anyway because the client needs this to be this way, or change the font, find a solution. So when I noticed that disconnect, and a lot of times I worked independently after this for several years just as a freelancer. And that's where I decided to co-found a studio after that, because like you mentioned, the overwhelm of, like trying to do everything at once. But I noticed when I worked with people, the consistently positive feedback that I got when people were really satisfied was, finally, someone listened to me, or thank you for doing what I actually asked for. So I thought, okay, if I co-found a studio, I need to focus on this part of the process. I can work with really talented designers, and I can kind of mentor them and help them connect that process between listening to the client and knowing design principles. So I can go to the designers, the illustrators I'm working with, and tell them, here's how we can execute this. And I kind of accidentally fell back into creative direction and then realized, okay, this is what I seem to be good at. So let me focus on this.
Have you had times though where you've presented something to a client and it's what you heard them say and what they wanted, and then you also had a different take on it that you presented to them, and they either took it or just does it?
Mhm.
Do you think it adds to the pitch at all to say this is what your vision is, or how we executed your vision, and here's a different idea?
I mean, honestly, I would say most of the time that's the case, is that my job in listening is to figure out what's important to them. And most people don't know how they want that to be done. So that's kind of what our work is figuring out not only how to make that happen, but how to make that happen within, like I said, design principles, because the client has core ideas and goals for what they're doing. But like I said, I'm pretty upfront with the clients about this, that, hey, I'm going to be bold with you. I'm going to tell you when this isn't a good idea. I'm going to tell you when this is going to damage your business. But when I talk about listening, it's listening about what they need. And then I'm supposed to kind of find the idea in between that. So most of the time, it probably does look different than what they expected. Or a lot of times people don't have expectations. They just know they need A, B, and C. And the designers are supposed to know how to make that happen.
Well, that's the magic of design, I think, is you have a
Mhm.
person that hasn't thought about it and doesn't know all the tools, and they come to a person and say, this is the vision I have. And then you go, okay, I'm hearing you. And you present it kind of a literal or a more literal version of what they say, and then you put it through your design brain and you say, this is what I think is good. And then maybe you even add on to the opposite of that, like something different, but still
Mhm.
along the vein, to be able to say, here's some selections just to give them a little variety. I wonder if that helps keep clients coming back for more, rather than just they say, this is what I want. You give them one thing and they go, okay, I'll take that, I guess.
I
Like,
think honestly that part also depends on the client themselves, because I usually ask people, there's kind of two specific processes I can go through. Um, so I would say actually most of the time I'm not creating something completely literal so much as finding what they want and then interpreting that and working with them to come up with something. However, there are people who I would say there's kind of two major groups of people that come to you as a designer. Number one says, I don't care how it's done. I need it right away. I need it to be done well. And you're the designer, come up with it. And then there's
mm,
people who say, this is my baby. I want to see the sketch. I want to see options. I want to explore. I want to iterate. And I want to see every single one of those steps and collaborate with you really closely. And so that's kind of like the two camps you have. And then every now and then, maybe you have someone who just wants you to get it done exactly one way. But I think most people, they're coming to you because they want those ideas. So I wouldn't say if I'm creating exactly precisely what they're saying, they could design it, so much as that I'm just listening to what they need. And I'm listening to the core parts of, maybe they, like I said, they say, oh, we need really high engagement. Here's an example for you. There was a company, Purple, that develops these mattresses. I don't know if you've heard of
mhm,
those before. And
I have.
they had this value system that they were developing for their team, kind of, here's the things that are important to us as a company. And in the past, they had a design that was gorgeous, but it was a little confusing to look at. So maybe when you were looking at it, you weren't really sure where your eyes were supposed to go. It was a little hard to read, but it was beautiful. And they said, we love this, but no one really understands it. Can you design something that's a bit more informative? So for me, I'm supposed to put all those pieces together and figure out how to do that. I ask them a lot of questions, and then I come up with something creative based on that. So I'm listening to them in the sense that they want it to be more informative, but how I creatively put that together are the options I present to them. And usually that is, maybe so like 3 options in terms of style. But I think the important part and reason why people come back is many times they go to designers and say, I want this. What they get back is something completely different. And so that's where people get frustrated because, well, they're paying for this and it's a service, they're commissioning someone, they have a need. They're not doing this for fun. In their company, they need people to understand those values. But when you have designers who think of the process as more like, you should be honored that you're working with me, now you can have a lot of frustration, and maybe they don't come back because they don't even really know what they're going to get if they ask for something. It's pretty unpredictable.
How quick does your artistic brain start working when you first meet a client? Do you, like, if Tascam came to you and said, we want to talk to you about a new marketing campaign we're doing, and then if you've never heard of it, do you go look it up, or do you just say, I'm going to be an empty cup going into this meeting, and then immediately when they start talking, are you formulating ideas while they're talking, or do you collect it all and then synthesize
Mhm.
something on the other end?
I do engage in a bit of research. However, I don't know if it's because I grew up in really rural areas, but I really love at least a digital meeting face to face to understand the kind of where the person's coming from. I try to look at it, and there's another artist, Chris Dew, who talks about this a little bit as well. And I was surprised and happy to see someone else's similar perspective. I think it's kind of like being a doctor trying to diagnose someone. So when someone gets on a call with me, I try not to say anything yet. I try to ask them a lot of questions. I think people really appreciate it. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but and people don't like sales. No one wants to be sold something. And I actually think people would underestimate how quickly people can pick up on it when you're trying to sell someone. So
Mm.
I think that most times when you come on a call and you're pitching someone and you're like, oh, you could upgrade to this, you could upgrade to that, they're already like, yeah, I'm not going to work with you again. So a lot of times I start by asking questions because if they have a pain point, I have all these designs, they're not accurate, or I have all of these illustrations, they're beautiful, but they're not in the size that they were supposed to be made in. If I can find those pain points or what they need, and solve them, I think they'll probably come back a lot more likely. And so sometimes I'm a little bold this way. And like I said, it might seem counterintuitive. Sometimes they go to me and they say, I need 500 icons. And I ask them questions. And then I say, I don't think you need 500 icons. I think you need 5 icons. And then I think you need to test those icons and see if you get a profit margin on what you're doing and invest that profit margin into more icons. Because if I'm helping to crash a business, I don't see how that's going to help me. And again, I don't know. I think part of this might come back to like, I was in really rural Washington, and that's kind of how like local communities do things. I've worked with local businesses before. But you really can't build a local community by just taking advantage of everyone around you. You're going to get a bad name. So I think people will be surprised how quickly that could happen online too. So I think people really appreciate it when you're trying to diagnose their actual situation and saying, and sometimes there are some rare cases where I'm honest with someone and say, this does need to actually be a higher budget than what you want, because let's say that they hire me for half the budget they need to, and they don't have the amount of resources or results that they need, and the whole thing was wasted. And maybe they need to wait a bit of time. I've done this to a few clients, actually. I've told them, I don't think that you're ready for this, but come back to me a few months later. And of course, I don't say it that way, but I've talked with them about it. And I think people do appreciate that. So I think that's something that the diagnosis of what's actually going on. I don't think any business wakes up one day and says, you know what, I feel like commissioning an artist for fun. I'm just going to support the arts. They have a pain point. They have a reason why they're doing this. So I think my job is to figure out what that reason is and to recommend a solution or a diagnosis for that problem. And many times it's a different problem. So I think that's why I prefer to not have as much assumptions coming in, because that might kind of taint the process. I want to hear from them.
Yeah, that's the difference, I think, between a partnership with a business and then just like a hourly labor contract where you're just here, you want 500 icons, I'll do it. But
exactly.
So then when you start to formulate those ideas, it happens pretty quick. Like what the first thing they say, we have an idea for a new tent. Are your wheels already spinning on, okay, what are we going to do with the tent? Like, is that how your mind pictures it? Or are you waiting to get all of that information in before you start putting those pieces together?
Yeah. So a lot of times when I start these calls, I do have a lot of ideas going on in my head. Excuse me. Hold on one second.
Okay.
So a lot of times I have these ideas spinning right away, right when the client starts talking. And I also see problem points, or maybe I look at for conflicts in what they're saying. Maybe they want one thing, but another aspect of what they're looking for conflicts with that. So I'm usually writing notes right away. And if any idea pops into my head, I'm usually trying to capture that. And then usually after I've completed that process and listened to them, that's when I start asking them questions about what they said, or repeating back to them what I think they're thinking, or proposing ideas, and then kind of try to see where it goes from there.
Okay. Do you ever like start sketching things out right in the meeting with them, or is it more just taking in the information and then doing the work later?
I think there's been a few times I've done that, but for me, mostly I work off of notes. I try to, because writing can be really quick, I can capture a lot of information. And then usually I kind of digest my own notes and then kind of come back to them with ideas based on that.
Yeah. There's 2 examples I can think of in just that come to mind when I think about having a customer tell you something and then you think that the opposite is true, or they're going the wrong direction with it. And that's one of them is I think the movie is called The Drummer with Rainn Wilson, I think his name is, the guy that played Dwight on The Office. And there's a scene in that movie where the person that he's a drummer in the movie, and there's a person writing a song, and the song is I'm So Bitter is the name of it. It's a really slow song and it's kind of depressing. And then he hears it and he goes, how about this? And he changes it to I'm Not Bitter. And it's an upbeat song. And
Hmm.
that, I mean, there's time for sad songs, but the way they present it in the movie, it's the better choice. So I wonder how often that happens when you're working with a customer. And then another one, and I don't have all the particulars of the story, but back in the day when the military was looking for a motorcycle to use, they the way the story I've heard goes, they put the contract out for bidding, and Indian Motorcycle did it, Harley Davidson did it. I think there was a brand that was doing it, but they wanted an American-made motorcycle for the American military, and the rules were it had to be certain size, be able to do these certain things, and be a 500cc engine.
Hmm.
And Indian made a 500cc bike, and Harley made it was either a 750 or an 800cc. And they came back and said, I mean, you want it to do all these things, it needs to be this big versus this big. And as I remember it, the military gave Harley Davidson the biggest part of that contract. I think they still did the Indian motorcycles too, but I think the more favored one by the military was the larger CC. So they didn't know they wanted it, but then when they were presented with it, they're like, okay, yeah, this is better. This is the one we want. It's going to perform better. So I wonder how much of that happens in design versus anytime you're dealing with a customer, because the customer may not know exactly what they want. Certainly you'll have customers that know exactly what, and they'll just tell you what they want. But
I mean, I
how
think it's
percentage-wise,
actually surprisingly common situation. I think you said most customers know what they want. I find that, oh, sorry, not most, that some of them do. Um, I find that a lot of people have those blank spaces. Most people, they know what they want to achieve, but they don't really know what it needs to look like. So I think a lot of times, like, problem solving is a huge part of the process, and not just problem solving, but creative thinking, especially when you're working as a creative director. It is so important. So, for example, logos, a lot of times you're creating a really simple symbol and to represent an entire brand. I think that's a pretty big responsibility. And I always try to think that this has to be every single logo really has a pressure to be like an act of genius. Someone needs to look at that and say, that's so obvious in hindsight. Maybe the H also makes the shape of the symbol of what they do. How did you think of that? And it's a tremendous amount of pressure on your shoulders to do that. But I think when you're not doing that, like you said, if you're just creating a logo and it has this like it's a nature company, it's just a leaf, it's an internet company, it's an internet icon, that's basically pointless. They could do that themselves or they could find that somewhere else. So really it's about finding these processes to discover ideas, about finding processes to work with those people. And so I think it starts with, like you said, the person gives you the brief, they say what they want. Now it's up to you to transform that into something else, to fill in those gaps. And especially, I think the challenge comes sometimes with the brief. Usually, I think more often than not, the brief and the goals and the parts of the project they need to achieve often are already really conflicting with each other or really difficult. I mean, it's so often that someone says, I need this to be really bold, and there's pages of text. Or, like that lady said, I need landscapes, but no green. And that's where, if you just did that, it would look terrible. And there's only a few times in my career that I've had to, most clients, they already know they can't do this. They need someone creative and they want those services. There's been just a few times in my career that they've been really, really insistent. So like you said, I said, okay, here's exactly what you want. Here's how I think what you want should look. And that comparison can be very helpful. But I would say surprisingly, most of the time, most of the people that I've worked with are pretty open to that. Okay, here's what you asked for. Here's how I think we should accomplish that. It might differ from what you thought originally, but it checks every box that you had.
do you see a difference in that between working for your own studio and then working for another, just as far as the percentage of customers that in the end accept your design versus not? Like, if you have your own studio and it's more specialty, do you have the experience that the customer is like, okay, I'm looking for specialty, I'm looking for this, and that's how they find you, so they're more likely to go with what you suggest?
That's a really good question, and actually hadn't thought about it that way myself, but that's actually very true. I actually did have more of those experiences before, and perhaps that's because after I went into these niche areas, I'm probably placing myself in industries where what I'm providing is more satisfactory to people or more what they're looking for. And when you can write your own copy and you present yourself to people, you talk to people, they know what to expect. Certainly, there's been times that I remember a meeting I had with one person, and I told her upfront, "Hey, I like being really bold. I like it. If you don't like the design, please tell me. That's more helpful for me. If I don't like an idea you have, I'm going to tell you." And she really didn't look very interested. This wasn't going to work for her. It was a more corporate office and a more that kind of situation. I don't look down on that. Those people work incredibly hard, but that culture that they had wasn't going to fit with the culture that I facilitate. And I think that turning off those people can actually sometimes be better for the both of us. So I suppose that you're probably right on the fact that when you're leading your own studio, there is the benefit of you can kind of be yourself and lead with your strengths. And if those strengths are not appealing to someone, then, at least that is really upfront in the beginning of the process. When you're working at an agency, you're not the head of that agency. So the kind of lead and face of that agency is definitely focused on the strengths of whoever is leading that. And, you definitely need to be willing to cater to that person's needs and direction. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, it makes sense that, especially once you get established and you start to develop a reputation for a certain type of work or a certain style, that you're going to attract people that want that style. So it makes sense, I guess. How do you see art affecting other industries that people wouldn't normally think it affects?
Yeah, so that's something really interesting because, if you look at the contrast between when I was a child and I'm painting and drawing and I'm just interested in art in general. And actually, I remember being very fascinated and curious, and that's kind of what drove me into it, was even just the tactile part of it. And I talked to some other artists, and for them, maybe they had a lot of emotions that were complex. They wanted to express them. So one thing I learned early on is that not all artists get into it for the same reason. A lot of us are interested in different parts. I have a bit of a technical take to it, and it took me some time to accept that there's going to be different approaches to things. So I think that one thing that I've realized over time is that I really enjoyed working on technical projects. And as I delved into that, I started to notice that a lot of my peers who consider themselves artists were also architects, product designers, packaging designers. And when I say packaging design, a lot of people think of, kind of trendy packaging design for maybe like a hipster honey label. But these people were designing medical boxes. They were designing product designs for manufacturing parts that go into cars. So I think there's actually a lot of stable technical art jobs out there that exist. And, people could argue all day whether or not they count as art or not, or what spectrum they land on, but they're definitely necessary and they're definitely out there. So I would say some areas that are kind of really important. Another one is, safety manuals, safety guidelines. We go through our day, we go on an airplane and we have this infographic and someone had to make that. And that was likely an artist. And usually that's vector as well. So that's kind of interesting. And, we go to packaging, to the ingredients label. I've created ingredient labels before. And I have to work with a food lawyer, the person who is hiring me as a food scientist. If an organization, I've worked with a few organizations that were doing scientific research, and sometimes they need to help with funding for their project. So they have these really complex concepts and work and research they're doing, but they need to do outreach to ordinary people that don't know about this. So they kind of need a designer or an illustrator to help them educate people in an accessible way that's, visual and easy to understand. So I found that there's kind of actually a huge thriving community of people who connect these arts and sciences. I think that the only thing to consider is there's also a tremendous amount of responsibility for both the artists and the people in the sciences, for the fact that, for example, if I'm illustrating something that's historical, um, I could be influencing, someone can reference this book in the future for how they're supposed to draw this figure. And that can create a butterfly effect. You can be responsible for completely distorting history. And so you have to take it upon yourself to do your research. Even though the book I had worked on, Lives of the Stoics, they actually had a historian review it. And I received critiques and edits from them. But I still think, even with that being said, there was I was illustrating a Stoic philosopher, and they were known, they had references in different texts about, the shininess of their bald head. And I just imagined if I had drawn them with like luscious locks of hair and,
Mhm.
maybe in some future movie they cast him as Brad Pitt. And then from there, it just all goes crazy and it's
Yeah.
completely out of line. So there's a huge responsibility, whether it be miseducating people, because textbooks a lot of times also include, artworks to help educate people. And when we look at some of the studies on it, there is sometimes some problematic areas where maybe the artist didn't understand what they were depicting, or they depicted in a really confusing way. So whether it be education, safety, uh, history, we really have to consider the fact that I think a lot of artists, we feel like, oh, I'm not a mathematician. I'm not good at math. I'm not good at science. I'm just an artist. That's what I do. And then, people think of it this polarized way. But I do think, as I've delved into the technical side of illustration, it makes me realize that sometimes we do have to face the fact that that might be a part of our work, and we might have to take responsibility for that research, whether we like it or not, because it's quite important. It can become a really big priority in some of these projects.
Yeah, that's a lot of good points. A lot of good points. So you really can affect what somebody sees the world like through art. I can think of just in kindergarten, the way there were the months, it had the months of the year
Hmm.
set up around the blackboard. And I remember what they look like, but I also remember the shape they were in. And even today, I think of January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August. And then for some reason in my head, September, October, November,
Oh,
December
wow.
goes horizontal.
Mhm.
And it, I realized that some years back, but I was like, man, why do I think of the year dividing between a vertical and a horizontal? And that has to be what it is, because that's the
Mhm.
way it was when I learned it. So that's how you end up with, I guess, people with the blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus, and you're thinking of the Bible, of just those old oil paintings that they put in the bigger Bibles that are printed, in the 70s or whatever, that that's your pastoral view
Mhm.
of Bible scenes, and there's a shepherd with sheep and the grass is green and there's rolling hills, and you're like, "Oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful."
Mhm.
And I end up over there in the military walking through Babylon or other places, and you're like,
Oh,
"Whoa, this
wow.
is this is not like the oil paintings. This
Mhm.
world, the shepherd he doesn't have the little crook staff. He has a stick, and it's a branch, really, a branch, and he's
Mhm.
just like kind of directing the sheep. And there's not 200 sheep. There's 3 or 4 sheep, and they're eating these little, maybe you could call it some sort of plant life growing out of dirt. There's no
Mhm.
grass and rolling fields, and maybe there is that other places over there, but it does. It's a good point that art can affect your view of the world even before you've experienced the world. Hmm. And Seneca, was Seneca bald? Was Socrates bald? It's important to understand all those things when you're writing those textbooks. There's a show called Abstract. I think it was on Netflix. It had a couple seasons, but they talk about art and design in different things. And there's architecture, building cars was one of them. So car
Mhm.
design. And I remember the one in the car design, the guy said, if you can't make your car distinct by using just 3 lines, then it's not a good design. And then you think back into how many distinctive cars could you draw to where people would recognize just in 3 lines? And I mean, it's true. The ones that stick in your mind, you could do with 3 lines. So why do you think that humans care so much about what things look like, about art at all? Why is it so important?
I actually think that that ties a lot into, and by the way, thank you for the fantastic examples, that especially the last one that you mentioned about the cars. I think I will mention that that comes back to when I talk about vector being strong in the geometry with these really simple lines. That would be a great example of the strengths. So you're really thinking a lot and kind of formulating and ruminating about shapes and thinking about shapes all the time, maybe even having dreams about shapes, and you get obsessed with it. But that's really interesting. And that was some really fantastic stories that you shared. Thank you so much. And yeah, so I think it really comes back to just our roots and our origins. I think that, we have really, when our eyes are open, studies find that almost over half of our neural tissue and all these things going on in our mind are related to vision and visuals. And this gets a bit misquoted in the sense that people say, okay, this is just sight, this is just design, but this is spatial awareness, this is where we are in relative to other things, this is the colors of things, this is danger. We also have to associate memories and different cues with visuals. I think that's where it comes back to design. So that's kind of like deconstructing those things. So essentially, a lot of times when we see a stop sign and we're driving, we actually stop before we read the word. We're not going STOP. We see letters as kind of individual pictures and then words as their own formulated picture. And people have varying theories on letters, so I can't say definitively, but basically we need those signals. It's just super important for our day-to-day lives to be able to see dangers, to be able to identify foods, to be able to interact with our environment. And although the other senses are important, that it takes a huge priority in terms of just how we have to survive and how we have to interact with our environment. So I think it's kind of like the other way around. I think that is important to begin with in terms of our biology. And what design does, it unravels that and reconstructs it. So we're saying, okay, for example, interior design is another place where people might not even consider themselves dealing with sciences, but they really are. Because if you make a waiting room lit with red lights, that's going to stress people out so much. Red is usually danger or stop, and it's contextual, and our minds know that. But you put that in a waiting room, people are going to be really anxious. And so interior designers work with colors, space, and visuals to make us comfortable, or, that you have that professional feeling as well, the idea of cleanliness and pureness. So I think what becomes important here, and this is where it gets a little challenging as an artist, and this is why I talk about AI and ethics, is when people are deconstructing how we think, in these really basic ways, and these sort of like primitive instincts, there can be an ethical way to do it and there can be unethical ways to do it. So when it comes to marketing, we can have these really unethical manipulative tactics, and we can also have people, for example, with education. I think that's where I talked about where science is important in art. I think where art is important in science is recognizing that this can help people learn. Like what you mentioned with the dates in the calendar, it can help people understand things. And there's a lot of designers who say this is people talk about recently, a lot of talk about visual learners. And I did some research on that. And it's a little bit of a myth in the sense that you don't really have like one person's a visual learner, the other person only learns from text. Most people, our brains aren't that different. We have kind of a lot of the same parts that make up our minds. So a lot of us could benefit from a variety of learning techniques. But I think what's important is recognizing that and trying to study and utilize how do we do good with that. And like what we mentioned, how do we try to educate people and artists around us, scientists around us, engineers, about the importance of, both for the artists to do research, to talk to, because so for example, I worked in the open source community a while back, and a lot of those people don't have access to many designers, and many times they get into arguments about how things should be from a technical perspective, and the designers say, well, this doesn't look good. And so I think if we could all try to shift towards listening a bit more and collaborating, I think that divide can actually have pretty big consequences when we just say, well, I'm just not going to deal with any engineering people in my life. I'm not going to try to do any mathematics. I'm just an artist. I'm free from all those things. I don't have any responsibility in that area. But I think we actually kind of do have a responsibility. And then when it comes to the, STEM areas where they say, okay, artists aren't doing anything important, that we can use text only. That's where I talked about Canva, right? Because when it comes to initial learning, that's the time that visuals are the most important, actually. So when someone knows a subject really, really well, they find that when someone has an illustration, it can be just a bit distracting. But when someone's trying to learn something new, that increases the accessibility. So if you have a topic, if you were trying to populate the internet with educational resources, including visuals in that process can really help a lot of people understand those things and help make that education accessible to a lot more people.
Have you ever worked with anyone that couldn't see, that was blind, that was either blind from birth or blind and after they had already had a life of being able to see?
I haven't worked with someone who is purely blind, but interestingly enough, when I worked in the open source community, there were a lot of people who were colorblind, and that did influence, so in some initial designs I created in mind with color, and they said, well, I can't see this because the contrast isn't very nice. And actually that was a great learning experience for me, because I increased the contrast, and someone contacted me and said, this UI you made for this program, it's so high contrast and I have eye problems and it's fatiguing my eyes. So then I had to kind of work with the people, and there were several people, actually, interestingly enough, I think it was in the open source community, because I would assume that maybe it attracted more of those kinds of people that weren't listened to or couldn't use other programs. They could influence, open source programs. So we had several people who are colorblind, and there's a spectrum of the type of colors you can see. So you have to really learn about values and, like the fonts you're using and how to create those in a way that are usable for them. But then you also have people who might have, a bit of eye strain or eye fatigue. And then if you make it really high contrast, now they can't use it. So, that's kind of an ongoing process to this day. Sometimes I think about going back and, with all the experience I have, even going and revising some of the old projects that I contributed to open source projects, to see if I can even just inch that balance to a little bit more in between, because it can be actually really challenging. But it's definitely important to do, because these people, if they can't use another program, then it's really not, this is really the option they have. So you really do need to listen to them.
Yeah, I always wondered about, perspectives. I think that's one of the reasons we're living, is to understand perspectives better. And we always can't we only have the perspective we have. So you can you can talk to someone else and see what they think about it. But it's always been interesting for people that, if you're talking about art, to be able to talk to people that can't see and see how that changes how you interact with art. Whether it's definitely got to be more tactile, but it's the thing you said with, it's the other way around of why humans like design so much. And I don't know if you meant it this way, but that's how my brain was dealing with it, because I feel like I still need to think about it more and what that actually means, that it's the other way around, that it would mean that design likes humans. And then I started thinking about that. I'm like, wow, I wonder if you've never seen, or if you think about people in senses we have and senses we don't have. Like, we don't
Mhm.
know that we don't have things, or we can't see in a different part of the spectrum or whatever else. That if you thought about design with that, does that add something else to it for certain people or for no people? I don't know. If you added I think about it in music too. If you have these things that it seems like some people can't hear every little thing. Like if you have someone that works a soundboard or does recording in a studio, they listen to music differently than a normal person listens to it. So I wonder if they heard a CD or a recording, a regular person would go, yeah, that sounds good. And they would say, no, it doesn't sound good because this, and this, and they can change those things. And then the normal person would go, oh, that does sound good. That sounds different. Or it works into that natural 12 bar or 12 note way that music works. That may be a different conversation, but I wonder if that's the same thing with visual art, where if you have somebody that's trained and they know the geometry behind the shape, that they could change it enough to where it would look different to a regular person and it would look better. And you could explain why it looked better, because this line is this shape versus this shape.
Mhm.
And maybe that's the same thing with your color gradient, is people can see it differently. And then of course you're going to have so many different people with different perspectives and different abilities that they can't see the gradient, or it bothers them a certain way for whatever reason.
Mhm.
Then it makes me think about the idea that whatever color we think a color is just what we think it is. We don't know
Mhm.
if everyone else is seeing that color the same way. So maybe that's too much, thinking too much into it, but I wonder what could be gleaned for visual art by talking to someone that doesn't see anymore, and then someone that has never seen, and
Mhm.
what they think when you describe something to them. What are they seeing in their mind's eye, or how are they experiencing the description of a picture if they've never seen a picture?
Well, that's extremely fascinating. I think that's a really wonderful perspective to bring to it. I do believe strongly that, well, I would say that's not something people usually think about to start. And that's kind of sad because we look at, that's where you would go into like the art of civil engineering. Those are some of the few people who think about that. You know, those areas on the sidewalk that are painted yellow and they have the bumps on them for wheelchairs. And that's
Mhm.
someone deconstructing the perspective of someone who can't see, or, you know, who can't have the ability to interact with just the color. But I don't think that's something people think about very often. And you make a good point in the fact that it's quite important because we're in an era where people are moving towards visuals very heavily. I know there was actually a movie I loved, and they did some really interesting. It is a Spider-Man movie, but it was the Into the Spider-Verse movie. They did some really interesting 3D designs with halftones, and they mixed comic feels, and they would do these flashes of these bursts of color, and they caused, I believe, if I remember correctly, a lot of concerns over epilepsy because the flashing lights, and no one had thought about it from that perspective. So I think that's something that when we're trying to push the frontier of visuals, we're looking at from our own perspective or from the perspective of kind of these common statistics that we look at and averages. But it could actually also, because like what you mentioned, when we're looking at it from another angle, it can improve the depth of the work that we're doing. And that's very fascinating. I think when it comes to what you mentioned about the colors, I overthink a lot. That's kind of my job, but I also do it in my off time. And so when it comes to like we don't see the same colors, I think that also relates to words because I think when it comes down to it, um, art and design in general, most people say is a form of communication. And if we relate that to like, you know, hieroglyphics and things like that, we're creating symbols that represent, whether it be a color to represent hunger, or a symbol to, like with the cars, to represent something that's sleek and innovative and fast. We're trying to create these symbols that communicate to people's minds faster than if they were reading an essay on it. And something that fascinates me about words is that we have the tendency to assume that how we're talking is how it's received. And that's, completely not how it is. We kind of have the idea in our mind, and then what words we associate those ideas with. And we're just trying to connect that to someone else, but that also connects to the words they associate that with. So I know there's been many times, and I would say almost every time, there's data loss when we communicate with each other. And, it's not like we're plugging something in and downloading and transferring it. So there's some amount of the concept is lost. But many times I've tried to maybe encourage a friend and told them something that I thought was inspiring. And they said, wow, that's really encouraging. And they repeated back to me what encouraged them. And it was completely not what I was trying to say. But it was a great idea. And that's where it gets really complicated and kind of spirals into, even with design, right? There was a recent time that I created a piece that I thought was really interesting and inspired by kind of fantasy characters. And I showed it to someone and they said, that's really trippy and psychedelic. And for a moment there, I was a little offended. I'm like, this wasn't psychedelic. This is fantasy. And I kind of settled with the fact that, well, if they received it as psychedelic, that's what it is to them. If I can either keep going with how I see it, which is a perfectly fine option. I'm sure many artists have their own vision and maybe no one understands their ideas. I could also, if you want to, think reverse engineer that, like, how is this person seeing it and how would I tweak it so they saw it the way I intended it? That's another approach. But I think that also depends on how commercial it is, because I think when it comes to personal pieces, the point of art is to say, we have cameras, we can capture things as they are. Here's how it is to me. This is a look into my mind. There is eras that classical artists went through where maybe they were depressed and it was called the blue era, and they only drew completely, all of his paintings were in blue. And that's not factual, but that gives a slice of someone's inner life. But then, when it comes to the professional world, it's a little tricky because I'm actually trying to think of how other people are thinking. And I'm trying to engineer not, what's my feeling, but what's other people's feelings, what are their feelings going to be? And that's when you release something and you get a reaction that's really different from what you intended. You actually have to be willing to look at where it went wrong and adjust it to get the right response approximately, even though you can never completely intend one thing and have it be received exactly the way it was intended. And I think that's where a lot of people have these processes, like the lean process, where you launch something, you evaluate it, you look at where it went wrong, and then you launch it again. And that's something I do myself, when I'm looking at my artwork, but whether or not people do that in the actual campaigns and stuff, that depends on their particular approach to things. And then also, because there's many approaches. Some people say just launch fast, fail fast, see what happens. As long as there's some amount of self-reflection, I suppose different people have their own approaches. But it's really interesting because I can't really say at that point, because you could argue in a way that, well, that makes commercial art a derivative of art because you're thinking of, deconstructing how someone else is supposed to feel, compared to, maybe personal art is supposed to be about how you feel. But it exists for a reason. And if it can help people, then I'd say it's worthwhile in its own way.
Certainly a lesson to be learned from Shrek is that there's layers.
Yes, absolutely.
I think if you have that commercial art, it's speaking to someone, but it has its own feeling. So you look at it and you go, yes, that's in the style of, or derivative of, or that's here to take up this space on this wall. And maybe there's not as much thought that's gone into it than has gone into other things. So it makes me wonder, as far as creativity in general, is there this creative thing, this creative force that people recognize? And when you look at something that's abstract, And if you've never looked at something abstract before, maybe it hits you and you go, this is what this means to me. Kind of like if you listen to a poem and you go, this is what this means to me, but that's not what it meant to the person that wrote it. So it has a life of its own. So does this abstract piece of art that you've looked at and you don't understand what it means mean nothing to you? Or does it connect with something inside of you that is inside of every person that's just this creative force? And then if it was explained to you more of, well, this means this and this is that, and I did it when I was doing this and this was going on in my life, and then it means more to that person. But I worry in art, whether it's writing or visual or whatever, that if you explain it to someone, then they lose that little piece they were holding on to and thinking about what it means to them. But it does, when I think about it, it does seem to me to be this larger creative force that's out there, call it creativity or whatever, that we recognize when we see it. So when you look at that commercial art and you go, okay, that's a layer, that's an outer layer of this deeper meaning. And then when you look at something else, like, I'm not saying that Dada is a deep layer. I'm just saying that there are deeper layers than others. And if you connect with it or feel it more, or maybe if it's explained to you, that then you can look at it and go, okay, I really like this piece. You look at something and say, it speaks to me. Why do you say it speaks to me? It's because it's speaking to you. So what's your view of that creative force, and where do you think it comes from, if you think it is there?
I think that area is really interesting because I think with both writing and art, so many people try to answer the question of what is art. I think sometimes the fact that it's elusive is what makes people a bit uncomfortable with it, and we kind of try to define it in one way or the other. And I've seen people who make such good cases. I used to have my own definition for art until it kind of broke and it didn't fit with how it developed with my experiences. And so my thought is that I kind of feel like I know I'm talking about combining science and art, and I mean science in the sense of exploration and education. But I think we're at a time where people are very kind of assured by fundamental, facts and sciences that are very structural and certain. And that can also cause a problem with ideologies that are very certain, that are comforting. I think one reason why I'd say art is both important and why I think it makes people uncomfortable a lot of the time. I think because it's a bit elusive, and you could define it. You could say, well, art is important for what it means to the artist. But then you talked about this point of what it means to an individual outside of that artist. And you see there's artists out there who say, I don't care how people take it. I'm the boss of my own art. There's people who take feedback and say, I'm trying to capture. There's so many goals behind what people are doing. Some people are trying to capture an entire event, like, sometimes it's even something very serious, like a massacre. And this is important. And they're capturing it for these people, or a part of an experience they experienced with those people. And that's a shared experience. So I think the problem is that it kind of is so slippery to define. And I think that we're in a time where we really want that comfort of everything has to be in its box. I think that we see that in the sense as well with, I notice even in philosophy that there's a lot of people I know who will either hesitate to call themselves, philosophical thinker, or will just straight up say that you can't be one anymore, that philosophy is the study of past ideas. And I noticed that same kind of approach with art is defined in this way. I think that we have to be careful about the tendency to want to box all these things up in a neat and organized manner and ignore, the ethics, humanities, arts, and to not allow them to, if I may, maybe have a bit more of a spiritual space in our lives rather than a concrete space in our lives. I think that can be pretty important. And I think you're right in the sense that I do believe that there's a bit more to it than just concrete science, even though I think it can be used. Well, essentially, I think it should be used in combination and a bit more harmony than what it is right now. I feel like people are becoming a bit polarized. And that's where I would really love to see people work together a bit more, listen to each other a bit more, because if art gets kicked out of science or science gets kicked out of art, I could see that having repercussions for people, like you said, in terms of if in some of these social media sites where it's very based in visual aesthetics, it can cause huge amounts of misinformation to be spread around just for that reason that they're looking at how do I create something fast, something aesthetically pleasing, something that appeals to people's primal instincts. And then like when sciences are so inaccessible and people find them dull and boring, I wonder like how can we make people a little more engaged with how the world works around them? Because if we polarize these things and sciences, are uninteresting and dull and we're just going to accept what everyone says, and we're not going to explore anymore. And science isn't, about anyone could take a scientific approach because it is a methodology as well as, a point of research. I think that's important. I think it's something to consider that these things, how do I put this? Even though I'm talking about art and sciences together, I wouldn't necessarily like for art to become completely scientific, rather that I would love to see exploration within science and I would love to see more research within artwork, because I think if those things separate, that we might lose something.
Yeah. It seems like this is a little like, I don't know, woo-woo or whatever, but I think there's art in everything. So I don't think you're going to be able to separate it. Like even in a mathematical formula, you have the figures that mean it, but the idea is the art part that you go, oh, wow, that's, E equals MC squared. Wow. It's so I don't think you have to worry about it being separated to the point of where it will, how far it will go either direction. I think we definitely change things when we start taking out in like primary education, taking out art classes or taking out shop classes or whatever, where you're doing things with your hands, that's probably a part of what you need when you're getting that base programming, whether it's how the months are put around the board, or it's interesting when you think about why you think about things the way you do, how you can trace those back to, oh, well, this is why that happens, or that's why that happens. And I don't think people look at that enough, because either they don't know how to think or they don't bother to think. What was your broken definition of art then? And I'll tell you what my new definition is.
Yeah. So when I was really technical, and like I said, I was approaching burnout, which was a wake up call for me. So I was working all the time. So I got this really professional perspective, and that's where like it fell apart as I developed and took more time to myself, more days off to appreciate things around me. So I had this idea that art, we talk about in the way of semantics, people talk about, oh, this is the art of making money. This is the art of mathematics. This is the art of this or that. And so I thought art could be defined by anything that was intentional or served a purpose. So anything, that I set out to do and create intentionally and that accomplished that intention. And, so if I set out to create a chair and I create a chair, it's artful because it's a creation that I've made and it accomplishes those things. And then, as I got a little older, I realized, okay, well, if I'm completely excluding abstract art, I'm completely excluding accident. And that was another thing that was problematic for me. What about the parts in the process where this happens many times? And I was hard on myself because of this. I thought I failed. So sometimes I'm trying to create a design one way and it just doesn't go that way. It goes in a completely different direction. And I don't even know how. I'm trying to create one thing and it's accidentally, or maybe I click the wrong button and I click the wrong color and I go, wow, that actually looks really good. Well, am I a failed artist now because it's an accident? And it started to break down and I realized, okay, this isn't really able to fit in that box that I created.
Philosophy's getting in there now. Okay. So I like that definition. I think the definitions of art, I like hearing all of them. And I was in a group, a writers group, and we were trying to figure out a definition for it. And I have it written down somewhere, but I can't remember where it is. It's one of those things. But it was something about art is how you interact with it. And in thinking about what that definition was, and then thinking about vector art and all that, I came up with this definition of what art is like a day or two ago, which is art is creativity made tangible. And I think that's along the same lines of what you were talking about with what I will now call Rebecca's broken definition of art, is that it's something you created. So creativity is in there too. So it's anything that anyone creates is art. Certainly you could find it in there. And it's not going to, everybody's not going to agree with that. But it's something. And it depends on your perspective. If you don't like the picture, zoom in on it and then see if you like this, this smaller, more abstract piece. Oh, okay, that could be art. And think of how many times that this is the more philosophical side of life, that we only experience this little piece of life that we experience as a human, ourselves as an individual. And if it were a picture, we'd be right up on it. We wouldn't see the whole picture. So we're going to need time and distance from that to understand it even more. So who's to say you couldn't walk into any museum and just stand close to any picture and see the art in that little piece, that little pixel, if you will, and that you could back up and see even a bigger picture, and you could back up and see even a bigger picture, and you could back up and see even a bigger picture, or zoom in, zoom in, zoom in. And that's why I like the idea of the vector, is because it shows that mathematical base of the universe, if you will, that no matter the infinitely small, the infinitely large, it's still in that proportion, or you can still recognize it. So that's why I like the idea of the vector art.
One thing that strikes out to me about what you said, I would say that you have a broader idea in the sense that my definition was that it had to be useful, or that it had to be intentional, and that didn't leave room for accidents. If I expand on your idea a little bit, because one thing that really strikes me is how we use the word art, I think hints a little bit about how we subconsciously feel about it, even when we don't realize it ourselves. We talk even about the art of thinking, the art of how we treat people, sometimes the art of the world around us. And I think one thing that strikes me, I tried to ask myself, does it have to be tangible creation, right? Based on what you said. But I realized, what differentiates a thought behind an artful thought? Let's say that I want to treat people around me artfully, or I want to speak in a way that is, you could say there's an art to speaking. What differentiates that from just speaking? And I think that essentially a creation can be an action, and that sometimes we think of tangibility as a physical. But you even mentioned earlier, what if someone can't see, right? So sound, music is an art. So it doesn't have to be limited to a tangible physical object. But it does usually, and maybe I'll break this someday in my head, but it does usually involve an action and an intention, or an exploration of something. And I don't, beyond that, if you're just thinking in your head, looping in circles, people don't call that artful. But when you create systems for yourself to think, when you create intentions on how you want to treat people, and you explore ways to do that, that can also be a way of bringing art into your life.
Yeah, I think when you talk about art, it's going to have that word create or creativity in there somewhere. Wow. There's a lot of other things, like branches, if you will, that I have written down here to talk about, but I don't want to take up so much of your time. I'm glad that you talked about it this much. So what's the best way for people to be able to follow your work, or to get in touch with you if they wanted to use your studio to do some art design?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for talking to me. I am really honored to have the chance to have this conversation, to have a place to talk about these things. And I really appreciate the questions and thought you put into everything. So for my work, my studio is In Kinetic Studios. And so that's spelled in, as in the word in, inside, and kinetic, as in kinetic energy. So it spells ink and kinetic are combined together. So you can go to inkineticstudios.com, and that's where you will be able to find me and all my team members, where we do our work, and learn more about us.
Excellent. And I'll put that link in the show notes too. So when it comes out, if people want to just click on it, they can.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Do you have any other ideas or thoughts in conclusion?
Well, I'll just say one thing to leave things off at. This has been a really interesting conversation. I really liked spiraling into the details of things. I would just say that, well, if there's anything that I think is important about art and all of these things together, is that it does have meaning and purpose. And I think that in the world today, people can feel like everything's subjective. And I will just make a statement and say that I think the fact that we all have different perspectives doesn't mean that there's no truth out there, and that it doesn't mean that it's all pointless. I once talked to someone about this a little bit, and they were philosophically really into nihilism, and that's not where I lean towards. And the difference of opinion was, and where I will just point out for people to at least think about and consider, that I would love for people to consider, is that if it's the truth that everything's subjective, if it's a fact that everything's subjective, then that would be to say that everything is objectively subjective. And I can't say that, nihilism is right or wrong, or, because again, there's my perspective, but I think the truth is always worthwhile to pursue in art, in science, and all these things. Despite all the perspectives that we can bring into it, I do believe that it's always better to be closer to the truth than farther from it. And I think we can consider people's perspectives, and that's always important. But that's a way to get closer to the truth, not a way to feel like it's all pointless.
What do you think the source of the truth is then? Seems like the obvious question.
I don't know all the answers. I just figure that if we can try to construct the best answer that we can, then I think it's a worthy thing to do. And I prove myself wrong all the time. So, I have many years to keep searching.
Okay. That's a lot to think about, as well as some other stuff you said that I wrote down that I'm going to have to think about too. So maybe in the future we cover those topics if you have the time. But I definitely appreciate all your time today.
Thank you so much.
All right. I'll talk to you on the other side of this musical exit.
Okay, sounds good.
All right.